Good evening, everyone. My name is Jagna Nieuwazny. I'm from the Graduate School of Engineering of the Kitami Institute of Technology, and this presentation, called A Study on Implementing of Culture, Religion, and Time Awareness to Machine Ethics Algorithms, is an overview of the work that I performed in the course of my PhD studies. First of all, a short outline of what we are going to talk about today after an introduction and a few words of background in the field of AI and ethics. I'm going to walk you through 3 experiments that I performed in the course of my PhD and finish with some conclusions and ideas for future work. The main contributions of this thesis could be summed as follows. I verified how much religious vocabulary is present in secular media channels, namely in Japanese blogs, what emotional and moral associations such contents generate, and whether expressions containing Buddhist vocabulary are considered more proper or not from a moral point of view. I also verified whether what is taught as ethics in school overlaps with the society's understanding of ethics, and how much the pre-Second World War moral attitudes have in common with those of the Japanese people nowadays. And finally, I checked whether it would be possible for an author identification solution to correctly attribute works to authors if in the course of years they have changed opinions. First of all, a few words on why research such as mine matters. We are all aware of the fast development of new technologies, which is the how of technology. However, it's crucial that we ask ourselves what global changes those developments will bring, whether they are anticipated or even necessary, which is the why question, and whether such developments even should be made, which is the if question. Most scientists agree that any AI system whose task is to accompany humans is by definition obliged to have an ethical insight. However, the problem seems to be mostly that reducing ethical and moral questions to a set of universal rules poses a big challenge even to humans, and even more so to AI. A field of science that occupies itself with answering such questions is called machine ethics. And unlike the field of computer ethics, which has traditionally focused on ethical issues surrounding humans' use of machines, machine ethics is all about ensuring that the behavior of machines towards human users and perhaps other machines as well is ethically acceptable. There are a few challenges in this field, mainly how to implement ethical principles in machines and which exactly ethical principles to choose, as well as whether to do so through the aid of an implicit ethical agent or an explicit ethical agent, an implicit one being a machine that has been programmed to behave ethically without an explicit representation of ethical principles, whereas an explicit ethical agent is a machine that is able to calculate the best course of action in ethical dilemmas and is not restrained by the ethics of its creator. This problem was first brought up by Immanuel Kant in the 19th century, as he is the one who said that a machine that can learn to make ethical judgments but has no principle to justify them is not an ethical agent. There is, of course, also the centuries-old question of whether you can compute ethics at all. However, attempts have been made for over 100 years. The most famous one among them, made by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mills, is called the hedonistic act utilitarianism, which is a doctrine that holds that the right action is the one likely to result in the greatest overall pleasure, calculated by adding up units of pleasure and subtracting units of displeasure experienced by all those affected. People also ask themselves whether machines will ever be able of making ethical decisions since they lack emotions and thus cannot predict the feelings of those affected by their actions. However, I think that this can become an actual advantage as an artificial intelligence system can teach theorists of ethics pure ethical decision-making without the influence of emotion. My research, the aim of my research is to find what influences ethics and whether there is a universal core of ethics common for all humankind. And I try to answer these questions through performing experiments, the first one of them called Correlations between the Buddhist Religion and Ethics in Japanese Blog Contents. What I did was to analyze how much religious vocabulary, specifically Buddhist vocabulary, is present in everyday social space of the Japanese people, namely in blogs, analyze what emotional and moral associations such contents generate, and analyze whether expressions containing Buddhist vocabulary are considered appropriate or not from a moral point of view. First of all, to give you a short outline of the situation of organized religions in Japan, the graph you can see is based on a survey performed by the Japanese Ministry of Education, Science and Technology in 2014. And the aim of this survey was to have people answer, what religion are you? And as you can see, there is a total of 190 million respondents to the question, what religion are you? The only problem with this result being that the actual population of Japan is 126 million people only. So people often chose more than one answer to the question, what are your beliefs? This would point to a low level of formal identification with formalized religions in Japan, but this goes together with a high level of participation in religious rituals. Japanese visit temples or shrines in important moments in their lives. However, this does not explain to what degree is Buddhism actually present in the consciousness of the masses, and it also doesn't more specifically explain whether what is ethical behavior according to Buddhist principles equals with what the Japanese consider to be ethically correct. I wanted to know this, so I performed a certain experiment using the following resources. The first one being the Digital Dictionary of Buddhism, which is the largest dictionary of Buddhist terms available online. I also used Yatsis, which is the largest web-based blog corpus available for Japanese language based on Ameblo, a blog hosting service. And then a moral reasoning agent, which is an automatic reasoning agent applying a dynamic algorithm for moral reasoning. How it works is that it takes a sentence as an input and in a specified corpus, such as the internet or a blog corpus as above, searches for emotion types and morality-related concepts associating with the sentence contents. And the higher hit rate an expression had in the web search, the stronger was the association of the original phrase to the emotion and moral types. So for a query such as someone killed a man, you might get emotions such as fear or excitement, or social consequences such as praise, cold, award, and such. Upon performing an initial analysis in which I verified how many headwords from the Digital Dictionary of Buddhism would appear in Yatsis, I found out that there were over 15 million blog posts that contained terms related to Buddhism, and the most popular term appeared over 27,000 times. However, if you take a look at the top 10 terms, you might notice that most of them are actually common words in Japanese that happen to appear in the Buddhist canon, but carry no specifically Buddhist meaning. The top 1,700 words generated over 83% of the total of the output, but there were also 3,000 terms that only appeared once. I'm going now to show you a few hand-picked examples of running this initial analysis, one positive, one neutral, and one negative. The first positive example, kenko o kigan suru, to wish or pray for someone's health. The social consequences were good in 100% of the results, so it's generally considered appropriate to pray for someone's health. However, emotional consequences were overwhelmingly bad because it implies someone is sick, but also 75% of the responses found that it was unethical to pray rather than to try to save someone's life. And none of the results indicated it was an action worth praise. The neutral example, kaho o ukeru, to get what one deserves, be it reward or retribution, social consequences were 100% good. So Japanese people, at least Japanese blog users, seem to think that it is the right thing for the law of karma to function. Only 60% of the emotional consequences were good, however, because people are aware of the fact that you might get not only a reward, but a retribution as well. However, 71% again thought that it's an action worth praise, so it's good to get what you deserve. Now, the negative example, usotsuku, to tell a lie. The social consequences were split equally between good and bad, which is surprising because in Buddhism there is no concept of a white lie, and lying is always bad. And also 11% of the responses found that lying was something that was forgivable. I noticed the need for a second filtering, as much of the vocabulary was common words which appeared in the Buddhist canon but had no specifically Buddhist meaning. And so I performed a cross-check of headwords from the Digital Dictionary of Buddhism with Japanese Wikipedia in the category Buddhism. And if you look at a few of the examples, Rinne Tensei, transmigration, a very basic concept in Buddhism, you can notice a high rate of negative emotional consequences, which would indicate that people are aware that being stuck in the cycle of life, death, and rebirth is nothing good, as is further exemplified by the example sentence. In fact, I believe that it is not a good thing not being able to escape the cycle of death, rebirth, and transmigration. Another term, gedoshu, which means originally meaning a representative of a religion other than the Buddhist one, you might be surprised by the high level of positive social consequences in this one. However, this is mainly caused by the fact that Gedoshu lost its original meaning and now mostly represents people who are fans of certain trends in pop culture, or people doing something any other way than the orthodox way, so rebels, as is exemplified by the sentences, "Thus thinking in this way makes me one of the blasphemers, and this is a green turtle that I caught a long time ago while illegally fishing for bass." And then the final example, Soryo, monk. Now, monkhood is the highest rank in Buddhist society, so you might expect a high degree of both positive social as well as emotional consequences. However, the emotional consequences were rather negative, so people are aware of the hurdles that come with being a monk. As you can see by the example sentence, it's an arduous process to become a monk, and it's also hard once you become one. So to sum up this first experiment, I was able to prove that Buddhism as a topic is present in secular media channels, that several terms have had a religious meaning originally, but it was lost, and that there are sometimes surprising twists in terms of assessing social consequences of certain ethical concepts present in Buddhism. So if it is not religion that seems to be influencing ethics more than anything else, what about education? Which brings me to my second experiment, determining whether changes in ethical education influence moral values. What I did in the course of this experiment was to analyze ethics as taught in Japan before the Second World War and today to verify what do pre-Second World War moral attitudes have in common with those of contemporary Japanese, whether what is taught as ethics in school overlaps with the general population's understanding of ethics, and whether a major guideline of the a major reform of the guidelines for teaching ethics has changed the way common people approach it. So to sum it up in one research question, I wanted to know whether change in ethical education influences core moral values. To give you a short outline of the reforms of the education system in Japan, in 1873, the elementary school regulations introduced a subject called shushin, teaching of good virtue. And the objective of this subject was the education of an ideal imperial subjects, together with a set of taught core moral values such as piety, loyalty, friendship, courage, and finally submission of children to parents and teachers, the nation, and finally the emperor. In 1945, upon the defeat of Japan in the Second World War, shushin was terminated through the aim of the order of suspension of courses in morals, Japanese history, and geography. And in 1947, the fundamental law of education was introduced as part of a transition from pre-war militarist policies to a new law, together with a new school subject called dotoku, which can be roughly translatable as ethics, and a new set of promoted core moral values, such as self-sacrifice for the good of others, conformity over individuality, and the development of moral thinking. And since 2020, dotoku was introduced on par with traditional subjects like Japanese or math to elementary schools and junior high schools, and is now a graded subject. In this experiment, I use, first of all, a book called Shushin Kyoju Roku, Records from Lectures in Moral Education, which is a record of the content of 79 classes that Mori Nobuzo, a Japanese philosopher, gave on the subject of shushin between 1937 and 1939 to a class of future teachers. I also use Watashi Tachi no Dotoku, which is a textbook for the subject ethics taught in Japanese primary and junior high schools, as well as Aozora Bunko, a Japanese digital library of out-of-copyright books. Again, Yatsis as my corpus, and again, the moral reasoning agent to evaluate results. As a first step in preparing the data sample, I performed an OCR of both books, and sentence segmentations of both texts. And due to the size of the initial sample, I choose to only compare chapters referring to the same areas of morality. In my case, I chose the sacredness of human life, approaches to human life, and such. After I selected the chapters in question, I created a list of grammatical endings that might imply that the sentence contains an ethical warning, and then manually proceeded to remove sentences which brought no ethical meaning to them, and was finally left with a sample of 77 sentences from shushin and another 52 from Watashi Tachi no Dotoku, which I then evaluated using the moral reasoning agent. And upon analyzing those two data sets with the moral reasoning agent, I was left with 22 sentences for which I was able to run a complete analysis. Here you have the detailed results for the sentence, "Hito no inochi o sukuu," to save people's lives. If you look at social consequences, 100% of them being positive, you would notice that in terms of core moral values, there's little difference to be observed between the moral evaluation of an action between sentences from pre-war textbooks for ethics and a post-war textbook for ethics, and Yatsis, so a corpus of contemporary Japanese. So in spite of a huge shift in terms of which ethical values were promoted through school education, the understanding of morality, or a moral compass, one might say, of the Japanese people remained largely unchanged. So no amount of mistaken education can make people actually believe in things they do not find intrinsically true. However, what is most surprising is compared to the high level of positive social consequences, is a high level as well of emotional negative consequences for ethically positive terms, which would mean that the people are aware that what they find to be a positive phenomenon for society as a whole is not always positive for the individual performing a certain action. I did then a second experiment because in order to analyze the mentality of the average Japanese living in the 1930s, it would be ideal to compare the sample from the old textbook, Shushin Kyojiroku, with the corpus of sentences from the 1930s. But there is no such corpus available, so I decided to settle for the next best thing. And I replaced the corpus used by the moral reasoning agent. And instead of Yatsis, I used text from Aozora Bunko, the Japanese digital library, published before 1946. As I expected, those would be influenced by ethical ideas from the 1930s and before. And in this way, I enabled the moral reasoning agent to sort of simulate a pre-Second World War moral outlook. And here again, I was surprised to find out that the emotional response to ethically positive concepts was very unconclusive and ambiguous. So there was a discrepancy between behaviors beneficial to the individual engaged in a certain action and to broadly perceived society. And the value attributed to certain behaviors was far more negative or ambivalent when it came to the emotional response, which is in line with a theory called emotivism, or the hooray boo theory, formulated by Charles Leslie Stevenson and Jules Ayer. What it says is that ethical sentences do not express propositions, but emotional attitudes. And as such, while the respondent to certain ethical claims understands their positive value objectively, the overall positivity of the response is reduced due to the consciousness of its plausible negative emotional impact on the individual in question. And this theory proves quite interesting in the case of two more controversial terms from the data sample, which are kokudo, motherland, and kokumin, nation. If you look at an analysis for the term kokudo, motherland, social consequences, mostly positive. It's great to fight for the motherland. Emotional consequences, not very much so. So it is great to fight for the motherland unless it is me personally who has to do so. And then again, kokumin, nation, it's great to be part of a nation generally, unless it is me who has to deal with my nation, in which case I am not so sure about this anymore. Those two terms, kokudo and kokumin, are present in both the textbook for teaching ethics and the literature of the 1930s, and are included in the textbook for teaching ethics used nowadays in Japanese schools, but they are absent from the corpus of contemporary Japanese, and thus one might say they are absent from the state of mind of society. But what it further proves is that while subject to a school curriculum that was centered around values such as the nation, so nationalistic values, the Japanese chose to superficially believe or attribute value to what they were taught was morally proper, while at the same time privately they maintained a much more inconclusive approach to several ethical problems. To conclude, the moral compass of the Japanese people remained largely unchanged despite the reforms of the educational system, and there is apparently no way, even if ethical education is extreme or motivated by a political agenda, to change people's ethical beliefs. And this came together with a high level of awareness that behaving in the most moral way is not always pleasant or beneficial to the individual. And one more surprising conclusion is that after 1946, terms associated with nationalism left the broader society indifferent. I came to think if ethics as taught through school education also seem to have a limited impact on what people actually think is proper or not, what about historical events? And to educate myself further on this question, I performed the third experiment called a case study on authorship analysis of text by Arata Osada. I wanted to answer a twofold research question through this study. The first one being whether an author identification solution can correctly attribute work to authors if in the course of years they have undergone a major psychological transition. And the second question, what if the authorship attribution system encounters difficulties in detecting single authorship? Does it imply that historical events have a significant impact on a person's ethical outlook? First of all, what is authorship analysis? It is the process of determining authorship of a document based on its characteristics. And in a computational context, applications include forensic linguistics and online bullying detection, like blackmailing, letters, confessions, testaments, and such, bot detection, fake news or fake reviews, and marketing, so identifying the demographics of people that like or dislike a certain product. Who are the sympateki bunkanin, or progressive men or letters, that are going to be one of the subjects of the main subject of this study? It is a name given collectively to a group of Japanese intellectuals active after the Second World War, writing on democratic ideas and pacifism in Japan. However, problem being that the same people often supported Japanese militarism in the 1930s and quickly changed side upon Japan's defeat in the war. I chose to concentrate specifically on one representative of this group, Arata Osada, who was an educator and specialist in the history of education. Before the Second World War, he had very vocal views on patriotic education based on the German model, and authored newspapers with a militaristic undertone, where he wrote that Japanese want to be reborn 7 times to better serve their motherland, etc. During the war, on August 6, 1945, when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, he was seriously injured. And after the war, he underwent a major shift in opinions, became involved with pacifist groups, participated in the peace movement opposing nuclear arms, and also wrote a book for which he is quite known in Japan, Genbaku no Ko, in which he gathered proposals from boys and girls born in Hiroshima. He also appealed to abolish the imperial system and wrote many pacifist publications. I chose the Second World War as a cutoff point in this research due to its major impact on Japanese society, and I chose Arata Osada more specifically as a basis to create my sample, due to the fact that most of his writing is centered around the same subject, education, but his views have shifted quite dramatically over the years. And what I did was to build a binary text classification model based on a pre-trained language model, BERT, and the main task of this model was supposed to be to predict if 2 fragments of text that we present to it were produced by the same author or not, and with what accuracy. I again used Aozora Bunko to create a data sample in this research, as well as 4 books in total written by Arata Osada, 2 of which were published before and 2 of which were published after the Second World War. Now, the training set for my classifier consists of randomly picked samples from the Aozora library, where each sample is made of 2 paragraphs. 50% of the data set is comprised by positive samples, so both paragraphs have the same author, and the label is set to 1. And the remaining half or negative samples with the 0 labels. Now, positive samples are further divided into 3 subcategories of equal size. 2 paragraphs, same author, same document. 2 paragraphs from different documents by the same author, where the time lapse between the publication of the first and the second document is less than or equal to 10 years. I chose 10 years because this is the time lapse between writing the last book in the pre-war sample and the first post-war book by Arata Osada, so in comparison. Then the third category is 2 paragraphs from different documents by the same author, where the time lapse between the publication of the first and the second document is more than 10 years. And then there are negative samples. Negative samples where you have works by different authors where the time lapse is less than or equal to 10 years. And then finally, more than paragraphs from 2 documents by different authors where the time lapse is of more than 10 years. The test set composed of the 4 books by Arata Osada was compiled according to the same rules, the only difference being the fact that at least one of the paragraphs in each data point was sampled from his work. And in the case of negative samples, the other paragraph was picked from the same pool of documents as those used in the Aozora Bunko test set. Furthermore, I applied the same guidelines to create separate test sets for 3 other individual authors excluded from the Aozora Bunko dataset, with the aim of using them for different comparison with Osada. 2 of those authors are non-fiction writers, 1 is a fiction writer. I fine-tuned the Japanese BERT model on the Aozora training set for 1 epoch, and all data sets were created in 3 different permutations. And I repeated the training process 5 times on each variant of the data, which gave me a total of 15 models. As far as I know, this is the first analysis of temporal aspects in machine learning-based authorship analysis. And here are the results. In the case of a sample from the same author and the same document, as you would expect, the performance of the model was well above average, with accuracy exceeding 90% on all but 1 test set and 99% on 2 of them. And this would also mean that BERT is capable of discerning similarities in content not only between neighboring, but also distant samples from the same work. When increasing the distance, in the case of same author, different documents, when you had the distance of less or equal to 10 years, you had a drop in accuracy of 18% on average, and a further drop of almost 10% when you increased the distance between the publication of 2 documents. When it came to the sample from different authors and a distance of less than or equal to 10 years and more than 10 years, here actually the performance tends to increase with the time lapse because the style of writing and language evolves over time, making it easier for the model to make a distinction. Oh, I forgot to say that the orange bar is the confidence of the model in predictions and the blue bar is the actual accuracy. If we go back to the research question and ask ourselves once again whether the change in Osada's ethical values reflect itself in the predictions yielded by the authorship analysis system, when it comes to the drop in accuracy as the distance in years between 2 documents increases, it is very visible in the case of the data sample from Arata Osada, but this was actually true for all other writers. So there was a drop, quite obviously a drop in accuracy as the distance in years between the 2 documents increases, with the only exception of Asajiro Oka, who was a zoologist. I also had this hypothesis that novels would be more of a challenge for my model due to the fact that the content in novels is more diversified, and this proved true because in all categories of positive samples, the results for Kyoka Izumi were the lowest. So a diversified content of the sample would affect the performance of the model, and the results for the Aozora Bunko set, which also consists largely of work of fictions, was the second worst. So it would mean that the change in the author's opinions is less relevant to the model than a change in topic. I could also notice no clear-cut difference between pre- and post-war samples from Arata Osada's book. Actually, the accuracy for samples including 1 paragraph from each of Osada's 2 pre-war books was lower than for samples combining a pre-war and a post-war book, where the time lapse was bigger. However, and this is important, when it came to comparing distant documents, the Osada test set results were substantially lower than in the case of other non-fiction writers, Yukichi Fukuzawa and Asajiro Oka. And what is more, in the case of those 2 authors, there was a strong correlation between the confidence scores and the accuracy. However, only in the case of Arata Osada, the gap between the 2 values was widening as the time lapse increases, which would mean that the model thinks texts were actually written by two different people. So to go back to the research question, is it possible for an author identification solution to correctly attribute works to authors if they have undergone a major psychological transition? Actually, the change in opinions as expressed in writing can affect authorship analysis, and the impact of historical events, such as a war, on a person's ethical outlook is significant enough to make them express themselves in writing like a different person, at least from the point of view of an authorship identification model. I also had a few additional conclusions. There is a strong negative correlation between the time between two documents and the system's accuracy, and the drop in performance is highest for fiction books due to higher content diversity. There are a few more questions we need to ask ourselves. It became clear that we need to add the aspect of time-related changes into consideration when performing authorship analysis, but we need to figure out what factors and to what degree specifically change in a person's writing over time, whether there is a pattern of behavioral change observable through someone's writing, and what exactly constitutes a formative experience major enough to provoke an observable shift in opinions. To sum up what I spoke about today, first, I performed a preliminary experiment aimed at analyzing how much religious Buddhist vocabulary is present in everyday social space of the Japanese people, and was able to understand that the Japanese society's secular Buddhism is present in modern media channels. And while the general reaction to several expressions using Buddhist term was as expected, there were sometimes twists in terms of social consequences. And some concepts seem to have lost their original Buddhist meaning and instead became slang expressions. I then analyzed pre- and post-war textbooks for teaching ethics to verify how much do pre-Second World War moral attitudes have in common with those of contemporary Japanese, to what degree what is taught as ethics in school overlaps with the general population's understanding of ethics. And I was able to understand that past and contemporary Japanese share a similar moral outlook on certain basic moral concepts, that the evaluation of those concepts in terms of emotional consequences is inconclusive, and that phrases associated with a nationalist trend in education have disappeared from the scope of attention of post-war society. In the future, I'd like to perform the same process on 2 more samples related to work matters and patriotism, and check whether the Japanese really lost interest in ethical matters related to nationalist concepts through performing a survey. I finally verified whether a model created for the task of same authorship detection would correctly attribute works from different points in time to the same author, and with what accuracy if the author underwent a shift in opinions, and was able to understand that a major shift in one's opinions is often enough to convince the classification model that the authors are 2 different people. And I also was able to prove that historical events such as a war can change the way an author expresses his opinions in writing beyond the point of recognition for a single authorship identification solution. There's more work to be done, namely, I should compare the effect of different aspects relevant to the process of authorship analysis, analyze emotional attitudes towards different ethically relevant concepts in the works of the same author, and finally, define a list of text features that the model should take into consideration in order for it to be applied to other tasks, such as authorship analysis in online harassment. If there is one thing I would like you to take home from my presentation, the main idea of my thesis is that the development of personal AI systems requires supplementation with moral reasoning, and AI systems need to be aware of ethics not as a constant, but as a function with a correction on historical and cultural changes in moral reasoning influenced by several external factors. For today, this is all from me. Thank you very much for your attention.